Hey guys, welcome back. Sorry it's been a while. Been busy. Anyway, this video is I'm going to look at Saudi Arabia. Obviously, they've of late, as we've seen, they've made a big play, not just in the world of football, but in the world of sport. But taking football, because while Saudi Arabian money isn't new, we're seeing a massive boom right now, and we've seen this kind of thing before. So I guess the question is, is it different this time? Or is it destined to fail like all these other projects that we've seen in the past? The goal is obviously to cause a stir, to build on that and ultimately occupy a more significant place than they currently do in the world of football. A very, very, very difficult thing to do. A question I see being asked is this something to worry about? When you say worry, obviously the status quo in football benefits a select few teams. It's the Premier League and a few big teams on the continent, and that's changed a lot in my lifetime. So when you talk about being worried, I guess it's these sides you're talking about. For a lot of people, a change in the status quo isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's only bad if you have something to lose. So maybe worry's the wrong word. Is this something that's likely to have an impact on football as a whole, or is it, as I say, going to go the way of examples in the past, which we'll take a look at, and ultimately boom and bust, fail in a short space of time? So as I say, this has happened a few times over the years, and if we look at those examples, it's only a handful. Now, because this is obviously a very, very difficult thing to do to shake things up in football, and it costs a lot of money, so it's not something that countries or states decide to do very often. So I guess you kind of have to look at it on its own merit. But if we look at it in the past, if you go way back to the 40s, late 40s, 50s, you had the El Dorado League in Colombia. Now, that was the first example we've seen. They weren't paying transfer fees. This was off the back of being expelled from FIFA. So straight off the bat, it doesn't seem like something that's going to be sustainable in the world of football going forward. It wasn't. There was a lot of money paid for big stars, particularly from South America, Argentina. We did see players from Europe, from England going over too, but ultimately it was a lot of these players, it cost them their place playing for the national team. I think Di Stefano was probably the most high-profile player that went over, so it was significant. There was a chance to win a lot of money, but I think very quickly Colombia went about negotiating their way back into FIFA, and I think as part of that, the disbanding of this league was mapped out. So in the space of 5 years, it came about dramatically and it left very quickly. I suppose more sustainably, something that lasted over a longer period, we saw the North American Soccer League, the late 60s, 70s, early 80s. And I guess that's the best example of how we imagine these things to go, where you are offering big contracts to players who have already secured their legacy. They're in the twilight of the career. And we saw that with the likes of Pele, George Best, Johan Cruyff, Beckenbauer, Muller. And, I think this happened at a time when the game was kind of at its infancy in America. There wasn't really a big appetite for it. And ultimately, the project didn't go where they wanted it to. The league disbanded and we saw the formation of the MLS. Now, I know some probably still associate the MLS with this kind of thing, but it's the MLS has been entirely different. This is a league that over a long period has grown very organically. I think they gave up on that idea of trying to buy football and generate interest through these big transfers for big names. They have made an exception, but it's been years later that we've seen the likes of Beckham, Ibrahimovic, Thierry Henry go over, and I don't think there's any doubt about what them moves are designed to do. It is about building the profile of the game, but it's doing it from a foundation of strength. I think the United States is very kind of accepting of where it is in world football at the moment, and what you're seeing is a league that, as I say, is flourishing in its own right. It's become kind of the biggest hub in that part of the world, not just North America, but in a way, South America too. It's for players from Canada, Mexico, Central America, and the smaller leagues in the South. And we've seen, it's in a position now where it's developing players. We've seen players moving to Europe, having starred in the MLS, Almiron in the Premier League, Alphonso Davies obviously moving to Bayern Munich, probably the biggest star that's come out in recent years. But yeah, I think the MLS is a little bit different, and we've seen now that Messi's going to go and play there. I don't think this is designed to achieve anything that similar to what China or Saudi Arabia are trying to do. They are just in a position to do it, and it's good for their game. As I say, building on a very strong foundation that they've grown organically over a long period of time. And the most similar example that we've seen of what's happening right now with Saudi Arabia would obviously be China and the Chinese Super League. And this is where I kind of wanted to look at the two a little bit side by side and perhaps temper that opinion slightly that it's exactly the same and it's destined to fail, because I think these two projects are very, very different. And the reason that China failed, I wouldn't necessarily be thinking that's going to happen to Saudi. The two are very different. If we look at the Chinese Super League, it's a story of chaos from its inception before the big investment to the present day. With match fixing, gambling, so much corruption. We've seen so many punishments handed out, relegations to the top sides. And, so some of the best sides that have started to build a legacy, that have had all these top players, are winning titles 1 minute, the next completely dissolved going into the next season, gone from the league, popping up as a new team with a different name. I think there's a lot more to why China failed than just taking on a difficult project that was just very difficult to achieve the outcome. I think that there was a lot of problems that meant that it was kind of destined to fail from the start. So the spending in China ramped up quite slowly over a few years. We saw Drogba and Nelka heading over there. But then around 2017, it absolutely boomed. And we saw these huge transfers, huge wages with the likes of Carlos Tevez, Oscar, Hulk. It was similar to what we're seeing now with Saudi Arabia. And so within this, you try and get a sense of what the end game is. What are the motivations? Now, all countries are different. China's probably more different than most in that you never really know quite what's going on inside China. It's a very secretive country, so it's a little bit of guesswork as to what the project was about. Was it an image thing? Was it about economic diversification? I don't think so. I don't think China's economy needs football money. Obviously, they are a superpower. They're a superpower with a population that is very, very keen on football, particularly Premier League football, European football, and within that, stars like Ronaldo, Messi, Mbappe. It's a country with a great appetite for football, but their own domestic league is quite poor. And also, their national team is very poor. And this is a country that's generally quite successful on the world stage in anything they do, sport included, if we look at the Olympics. So I guess the idea was probably to invest this money, and with these top players coming in from elsewhere, that it would improve the domestic game, and over a period of time that would improve the quality of the football and have an impact on the national team, which is obviously very, very ambitious. I think what's key to note about China is that there was absolutely no sustainability built into this project. It was, as with everything in China, it goes through the government. That's just the way things are. The spending was government mandated. By all accounts, the president is a football fan. This was a decision that China made, and overnight you saw huge spending from businesses that were lent on by the government to put money into football at home and abroad. We saw these teams acquired and taking on the names of shipping companies and real estate groups. And as I say, that happened pretty much overnight. As fast as it happened, after a few short years, we saw the government basically bring about the end of it. They brought in salary caps, a massive 100% tax on foreign investment, and also salary caps specifically related to those foreign players, basically making it impossible. These, it caused a lot of debt, and it caused a lot of bankruptcy, and teams breaking the rules and going out of business. It was, and you kind of saw a fire sale really of trying to get these players out. Now, I think, probably via loopholes, a few are still there, but generally this age of investment in foreign talent is over. China clearly decided that it wasn't worthwhile. It wasn't something that they were that bothered about. Clearly, a lot of the money they were spending was just going into foreign hands for foreign players, so out of China. And they deemed that not worth it when they looked at the impact that it was having and how long perhaps it might take to have the impact that they were envisaging. They decided to bin it, and that's the story of the Chinese Super League. So we move on to Saudi Arabia. Now, when we talk about this investment from Saudi, we're talking about their sovereign wealth fund. We're talking about the PIF. Now, it's important to look at the bigger picture when you're trying to draw conclusions on this football project, because it's all tied in together with this Vision 2030 that Saudi Arabia has, this massive sport-wide investment that we've seen over the past few years. Just to take a look at it all, we've got the golf, which for a few years was hosting very lucrative invitationals before the Live Golf. The Live Golf obviously was very controversial, offering players huge sums of money to leave the PGA Tour. The PGA Tour originally digging their heels in and suggesting that this investment wasn't going to ultimately have an impact on golf and golf's legacy. Flash forward a short period of time and the two have merged. We look at boxing. Now, boxing obviously a little bit different. It's always generally about where the money is, and Saudi now occupies a place where only really Vegas can compete. We're seeing huge world title fights and now going to Saudi Arabia because ultimately it offers the biggest payday. That's no surprise with boxing, and you would imagine that's only going to continue. F1, obviously considered arguably the money sport. There's been a huge investment into motorsport in general, hosting any number of championships in Saudi Arabia. With Formula One, obviously you now have the Saudi Grand Prix, and not long ago there was an attempt by the PIF to purchase the sport of F1. The owners of the sport obviously refused, but it remains to be seen. There's certainly an interest there to acquire the entire sport of F1. Similar to the boxing, you've got the WWE, where they've hosted a number of exhibition events, and like F1, they are interested in purchasing WWE as a whole. And the list goes on, into tennis, horse racing, etc., and that which moves us on to football, which is obviously a very, very significant one because of the place that football holds in the world of sport. There's been a lot of investment in football. That they've invested in women's football, which if you're being a little bit cynical, you can see how that might fit into this idea of sports washing in terms of their image in relation to women's rights, women's sport. They've already been hosting for a few years big games in Europe, the Super Cup games with Spain, with Italy. They've been hosted in Saudi Arabia, and of course we're now seeing the investment into the Premier League. The PAF have acquired Newcastle United entirely. They have investment in Chelsea, which I know is the extent of which is currently being talked about, with regards to a conflict of interest on transfers. What happens there remains to be seen. They've also invested in the City Group that obviously own Manchester City. So this is a huge assault on the world of football. And what's probably kicked off this big spending spree on players is the PIF acquiring Saudi Arabia's 4 biggest clubs. Now, every time this happens, you look at the money and it really is crazy. I mean, he's on a contract worth £200 million a year. I mean, that's more than a lot of teams' budgets in the Premier League, La Liga. Not to forget that this money is completely tax-free. I think the offer to Messi was reportedly £500 million a year for one player. It's obscene money, but obviously I guess that's what you have to do. The money is ultimately the only way you're going to get these players at this point in time. The league doesn't have the legacy, doesn't have the prestige, but also it's no disrespect to Saudi Arabia, but these, especially when we're talking about European players, living in the likes of Paris, Madrid, it's a big upheaval to be moving from these cities to go and live in Saudi Arabia. So you're going to have to pay the money. So why might Saudi Arabia be different? I think the appetite is probably bigger. It's a small thing, but with the young population, I think they're very, very passionate about football. So they're going to fill their stadiums. They're going to be there's going to be an atmosphere within the Pro League. So, as I say, a small point, but possibly more appetite than in America, and maybe more appetite for the domestic game than in China. But I think certainly it's a bigger priority for the Saudi government, for the Saudi nation, than we've seen with other countries in the past. And I think, and that comes back to, as I mentioned, this idea of sports washing. Now, I've said I don't want to be disrespectful, and I don't want to make any of these comments coming from a place of kind of, perfect morality, because the West has its problems as well with regards to LGBT rights, with regards to women's rights, and it wasn't long ago that we were very draconian with regards to these issues, and we absolutely haven't got it right currently. So whilst I do take the point about glass houses and whatnot, there is no getting away from the fact that Saudi Arabia is a brutal, brutal dictatorship where political opposition is basically non-existent. They carry out routine executions and mass executions of political opponents, a lot of which are reportedly tortured into false confessions. And I know there's been some steps made over the past few years, I guess as kind of as a bit of an image thing with regards to rights for women, but for a long time it's been a very, very oppressive place to be a woman, and still today they are second-class citizens in their own country. So, sports washing is important when you think about the goals of Saudi Arabia and how they want to be a centre for world sport, which is obviously going to include a lot of tourism, a lot of investment in tourism. And if these less than favourable facts about your country are what people think about when they think about Saudi Arabia, that's obviously going to be an issue with regards to tourism. But it is working because, we talk about Saudi Arabia now, we talk about investment in football, we're talking about golf, we're talking about Cristiano Ronaldo, so it clearly can have an impact. And ultimately, without getting too deep on the situation, we're seeing in the news a lot of, obviously, huge coverage about the war currently in Ukraine, Russia, and rightly so. It's an awful thing that's going on, but it's been dominating our news for some time. The Amnesty International and various other organisations will tell you that Saudi Arabia is currently involved in a war that has brought about the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now in Yemen, and that's something that doesn't get talked about, and it just goes to show, that whilst morale, we have our morals on one hand, we also have our price, and money clearly, if you throw enough at it, or if you have the right financial ties, it can make certain problems go away or be hidden by the news media or whatever. So you can see why it clearly is a big push. And obviously the other one, if we're getting years ahead, this is, it's no secret where the wealth of Saudi Arabia, the largest Gulf state, their assets are beneath the ground. And we live in a changing world. Obviously, we can talk about climate change and global warming, but ultimately these resources are finite anyway. So economic diversification is, I imagine, a lot more of a priority for a country like Saudi Arabia that wants to maintain its place in the world as not only the oil itself, but certainly the dependency on oil might fade over a long period of time. We're talking decades, but obviously it is still a consideration. Anyway, bringing it back to football, this has happened before. It's clearly very, very difficult to have an impact on the global football pyramid that is pretty much set, and it's been set over a long, long period of time. It's very difficult to come and change that overnight. So how do you approach it? We talk about spending money on big players in the twilight of their career. It's something we've seen before in projects that have failed, but I don't think there is any other way to go about it. If you want to do things fast, you need to throw money at it. If you want to throw money at it, these are the kind of players that you are going to attract. Saudi is going to have to deal with that perception of, for now being looked at as a bit of a retirement league. And for all those players that perhaps don't fit that description, we'll dismiss them as mercenaries. Obviously, the plan was to have Ronaldo and Messi playing for the two big teams in Riyadh, which would have been significant. Hasn't happened, but they haven't been deterred. They've continued, and they've signed the current Ballon d'Or holder. We're expecting to see the likes of Aubameyang, Sanchez, that, we're not surprised when we see that these players are moving to Saudi Arabia, but we are surprised when we see Ruben Neves go, maybe Hakim Ziyech. I know Kante has had his injury troubles, but 32, you'd still think he has something to offer in Europe. He's gone. And then you have your even more surprising ones. We're looking at, as I speak now, it looks like Brozovic is going to head over. Firmino looks like he might be heading over. And I think the big one that people have surprised a lot of people is Bernardo Silva. As I say, as I speak now, there's an offer on the table. Whether if he does reject Saudi Arabia and stays at City or goes to PSG, expect it to be someone else in the not too distant future. There is undoubtedly going to be that player that kind of shocks us and we think, wow, that was a top player that had so much to give in Europe, has gone there. Ultimately, though, Saudi's not going to be successful if it is just a destination for retirees and mercenaries, if we can call them that. The league needs to take a little bit of a leaf out of the MLS and lean on what it can, so that supporting cast of players are up to standard. If anyone watched games from China, it was a bit farcical at times. The difference in quality clearly between the foreign players and the domestic players. And that's obviously going to really weaken the product if that's the case going forward. So when you look at what Saudi does have, it's a Muslim country. There isn't a Muslim country where players can go and earn that kind of cash at the moment. So maybe Saudi Arabia can become a hub for the Middle East. I know Middle Eastern football isn't massively strong, but if we're talking about the cream at the top, there's some very good players, that have come out of Iran, Egypt. There's if these players, Saudi becomes their destination, then obviously that will improve the quality of the league. And when we look at Africa as well, these are players that are leaving, comparatively poorer countries. So I don't think it's the same kind of sell trying to bring in African players as it perhaps is trying to bring in European players. So there are things that the Saudi league can draw upon. Obviously, they need to invest in grassroots. That's very important. We saw at the World Cup, it's a national team that's definitely improved over the past few years, but they need to keep investing. And I think the main thing, obviously, is to be patient. If ultimately you want to succeed, it's uncharted territory, isn't it? Because we've seen, as I say, boom and bust with all these other previous attempts. And for Saudi, they just have to keep going and keep doing what they're doing, keep trying to improve. And I think, look, much like with, as I mentioned, with the golf, where you set your stall out and you say, we're not interested in what they're trying to do. Ultimately, money does talk. And I think for Saudi, it'd be interesting to see what happens if they're still doing this in 5 years' time. We saw the Super League when that came about. That's obviously, I don't think that's gone away for certain clubs, certainly outside of the Premier League. So when these kind of conversations come about, if Saudi is, the place where, you've got Ballon d'Or winners playing and huge names in football, then maybe they'll have a seat at the table. And then you look at things like the Champions League. Obviously, you've got Australian teams playing in the Asian Cup, Israeli teams play in the Champions League currently. So it wouldn't be the first time that a team from outside of the Confederations continent has been involved in the continental competition. So I guess for Saudi Arabia, it is just a case of continuing what they're doing. And I think really we just have to cross this bridge again in 4 or 5 years' time. And I know that's doesn't really give a conclusion, but I do think this is different. I think the motives behind it are something we've not seen before. The investment in sport as a whole is something that we've not seen before. It's definitely something to be taken seriously. I don't think it will have too much of an impact on the European game. I think that it will take more than this to disrupt what we have here in Europe. But it is certainly something to be taken seriously, and I would be looking at it with a bit more seriousness than China. So look, it remains to be seen, but no doubt very, very interesting times. So that's that really. That's my take on it. Probably not much of a conclusion there. Pick the bones out of that. Let me know what you think. Please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you soon.